Russian Revolution, How a Nation Changed the World Forever. Introduction. The world on the brink of change. Hype-building start. Imagine a country so vast that it spans 11 time zones, where peasants toil endlessly while an emperor lives in unimaginable luxury. Picture streets filled with hungry people, factories echoing with workers' cries, and battlefields littered with soldiers dying for a war they don't understand. Now imagine this boiling pot of despair erupting into a revolution so fierce that it topples an empire over 300 years old and plants the seeds of an ideology that will reshape the world. The Russian Revolution wasn't just a national event, it was a global earthquake. In 1917, Russia didn't just change its leaders, it changed the rules of governance, the concept of equality, and the fate of millions. It birthed the Soviet Union, challenged capitalism, and inspired revolutions worldwide. Let us dive deep into this dramatic tale of hope, betrayal, and revolution. Setting the stage, the crumbling empire. In the early 20th century, Russia was a nation standing precariously on the edge of collapse. Its vastness was both its strength and its Achilles heel. Stretching across 11 time zones, this land of breathtaking beauty and untapped resources was ruled by an emperor who seemed oblivious to the storms brewing around him. Beneath the gilded domes of St. Petersburg and Moscow lay a society divided, disillusioned, and desperate for change. How does a 300-year-old dynasty crumble? How does an empire so vast and powerful fall to its knees? The answer lies in a cocktail of oppression, inequality, and unrelenting human suffering. Let us journey into the depths of the crumbling Russian Empire and uncover why the seeds of revolution found such fertile ground. 1. The Romanov dynasty, a legacy of autocracy. For over 3 centuries, the Romanov family ruled Russia with an iron grip. They presided over a feudal society that seemed untouched by the winds of modernity sweeping through Europe. While industrial revolutions transformed Western nations, Russia clung to an outdated system where the Tsar was seen as a divine ruler, accountable to no one but God. Czar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, was not a tyrant in the traditional sense. Instead, he was a well-meaning but weak leader who lacked the vision and decisiveness needed to steer a nation in crisis. His rule epitomized autocratic rigidity. Decisions were made in isolation, reforms were stifled, and dissent was met with brutal suppression. Nicholas believed in maintaining the Romanov legacy at all costs, even as the empire crumbled around him. The flawed leadership of Nicholas II. Nicholas was thrust into power at a young age, following the untimely death of his father, Alexander III. Unlike his predecessors, he lacked the political acumen and strength needed to manage the complexities of a rapidly changing world. His infamous words, "I am not prepared to be a Tsar, I never wanted to become one," encapsulated his reluctance and inadequacy. His reign saw growing unrest, from the Bloody Sunday massacre in 1905, where peaceful protesters were shot by imperial guards, to the humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, which shattered Russia's image as a global power. 2. The social divide. A nation of two worlds. Russia was a nation of glaring contrasts. The wealth and opulence of the aristocracy stood in stark opposition to the grinding poverty of the peasants and workers. The aristocracy's extravagance. The upper class, which made up less than 2% of the population, lived in unimaginable luxury. Lavish palaces, opulent balls, and excessive wealth defined their lives. This elite circle revolved around the Tsar and his court, seemingly untouched by the harsh realities faced by the majority of the population. One of the most extravagant examples of this excess was the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. While peasants starved, the Romanovs entertained guests with feasts and dances under glittering chandeliers. The peasant struggles. Peasants, who constituted over 80% of the population, lived in squalor. They were shackled by centuries-old feudal systems that offered little hope for upward mobility. Their homes were often no more than wooden huts with dirt floors, and they toiled endlessly on land they did not own. When famine struck, as it often did, entire villages perished unnoticed by the ruling elite. The rise of the urban proletariat. As industrialization slowly crept into Russian cities, it brought with it a new class, the urban workers. These factory laborers were subjected to grueling hours, meager wages, and unsafe conditions. The gap between their harsh realities and the promises of a better life sowed seeds of discontent. 3. A land of unrest, rebellions, and resistance. The discontent among the Russian people wasn't new, but by the early 20th century it had reached a boiling point. The failed revolution of 1905 had served as a warning to the Romanovs, but they had ignored it, dismissing the growing unrest as mere minor disturbances. The 1905 revolution, the massacre of peaceful protesters on Bloody Sunday, triggered nationwide strikes, mutinies, and revolts. Workers, peasants, and even some segments of the military rose up against the monarchy. In response, Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, promising reforms, including the creation of a parliamentary body, the Duma. However, these promises were hollow, as the Tsar maintained absolute power and continually undermined the authority of the Duma. The role of the intelligentsia, educated Russians, including writers, thinkers, and revolutionaries, played a crucial role in fueling discontent. Figures like Lenin, Trotsky, and Marxist theorists found an eager audience among students and workers who yearned for change. 4. The catalyst, World War. If Russia was a fragile vase, World War I was the hammer that shattered it. The empire's involvement in the war proved disastrous, both on the battlefield and at home. Military failures. Russia's army was vast but poorly equipped and led. Millions of soldiers were sent to the front lines without adequate training or weapons. By 1917, over 1.7 million soldiers had died, and morale was at an all-time low. Stories of soldiers sharing one rifle among 3 men and charging enemy lines without weapons highlighted the sheer desperation of the Russian military. Economic collapse. The war drained Russia's already fragile economy. Resources were diverted to the military effort, leading to shortages of food, fuel, and basic necessities. Inflation skyrocketed, and cities descended into chaos as breadlines grew longer and angrier. Social turmoil. Families were torn apart as men were conscripted into the army, leaving women to shoulder the burden at home. Strikes and protests became common as workers demanded better wages and conditions. 5. Rasputin, the final nail in the coffin. No discussion of Russia's decline is complete without mentioning Grigory Rasputin, the enigmatic monk who wielded immense influence over the royal family. The scandal of Rasputin. Rasputin gained the trust of Tsarina Alexandra by claiming to heal her son, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. His closeness to the royal family sparked rumors and scandals, further eroding the monarchy's credibility. The public saw Rasputin as a manipulative figure whose presence symbolized the corruption and incompetence of the Romanovs. His assassination. Rasputin was murdered by members of the aristocracy in 1916, but by then the damage to the Romanovs' reputation was irreparable. 6. A nation on the verge of revolution. By the beginning of 1917, Russia was a powder keg waiting to explode. The monarchy's inability to address the grievances of its people, combined with the devastating effects of World War I, created the perfect storm for revolution. The protests begin in February 1917. Protests erupted in Petrograd over food shortages and inflation. Women led the charge, marching through the streets and demanding bread. These protests quickly escalated into a full-scale uprising as workers and soldiers joined the movement. The chant of "Down with the Tsar" echoed through the streets. The army's defection. Perhaps the most significant turning point came when the army decided to side with the protesters. Soldiers refused to fire on their fellow citizens, effectively sealing the fate of the Romanovs. Conclusion. The cracks turned to ruins. The Russian Empire was a colossus with feet of clay. Its grandeur masked deep-rooted issues that had been ignored for far too long. By 1917, the empire was beyond saving. The Romanovs' inability to adapt to modernity, their ignorance of the people's suffering, and the devastating impact of World War I created the perfect storm. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic revolutions. The empire had fallen, and from its ashes, a new ideology was about to rise, one that would challenge the very foundations of the world order.